I stood frozen as Madison Blackwell grabbed the microphone, her cruel smile gleaming under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. 280 of the city's wealthiest donors turned their eyes toward me as she announced her twisted game. Ladies and gentlemen, for our special bonus auction tonight, I'm offering up my dedicated little analyst for an evening of spreadsheet romance. Her laughter echoed through the silent room as my face burned with humiliation. Who wants my boring number cruncher? She taunted, pointing directly at me. The crowd's uncomfortable murmurs felt like daggers piercing my chest. Then a deep voice from the back corner shattered the silence. $1 million. Every head turned as a tall stranger in an expensive charcoal suit walked forward with measured steps. He flashed a federal badge, locked eyes with Madison, and spoke one devastating sentence that would change everything. She's worth more than your entire family's freedom. 3 years of my life had led to this moment of public degradation. I was Hannah Morrison, 28 years old, a financial analyst at Meridian Technologies, who had clawed her way up from nothing. My parents, Tom and Linda Morrison, worked double shifts in an Ohio manufacturing town where dreams came in small packages and college meant student loans that followed you for decades. While other kids spent summers at camps, I spent mine learning spreadsheet formulas and investment principles determined to build something better. Meridian Technologies was supposed to be my golden ticket, a prestigious tech firm in downtown Seattle where innovation met opportunity. The glass towers and open concept offices promised a future I had only imagined. But from my first day, Madison Blackwell made it clear that people like me didn't belong in her world. Madison was everything I wasn't. 26 years old, blonde hair that cost more than my monthly rent, and a trust fund that could buy entire city blocks. She had attended Phillips Exeter Academy and graduated from Harvard Business School without ever worrying about tuition. Her father, Richard Blackwell, had built Meridian from a small software startup into a billion-dollar empire. Madison held the title of Vice President of Marketing, though everyone knew she was being groomed to inherit the kingdom. The harassment started subtly. Snide comments about my discount store clothes, deliberate exclusion from important meetings, assignment of impossible deadlines designed to make me fail. When I tried reporting these incidents to Human Resources Director Patricia Wells, would listen politely and then dismiss my concerns as misunderstandings or communication challenges. Madison's under a lot of pressure, Patricia would explain, shuffling through paperwork without meeting my eyes. Perhaps you could try being more understanding of her leadership style. But I knew exactly what Madison's leadership style was. It was the systematic destruction of anyone she perceived as beneath her social standing. I documented every incident, every cruel remark, every deliberate sabotage attempt. My file grew thicker each month, though it seemed to accomplish nothing except remind me of my powerlessness. The annual charity fundraiser for Seattle Children's Hospital was Meridian's most prestigious event. Attendance was mandatory for all employees above analyst level, though I barely qualified. I had purchased my black dress from a department store clearance rack, hoping it would help me blend into the background. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel's grand ballroom was transformed into an elegant auction house with ice sculptures and flower arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. Madison arrived fashionably late in a custom Valentino gown that shimmered like liquid gold. Her entrance commanded immediate attention, conversations pausing as heads turned to admire her ethereal beauty. She moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting tribute, air-kissing society matrons and charming tech executives with practiced ease. I tried to position myself near the silent auction tables, examining items I could never afford while avoiding Madison's inevitable approach. But she found me anyway, gliding over with a champagne flute and that predatory smile I had learned to fear. "Hannah, darling," she said loudly enough for nearby donors to hear. "Still shopping at Target, I see. How wonderfully authentic of you." Heat flooded my cheeks as several well-dressed couples glanced over with barely concealed amusement. I mumbled something about supporting affordable fashion while Madison's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Oh, you're such an inspiration," she continued, touching my arm with a false warmth, proving that anyone can work here regardless of their background or breeding. The words stung because they were calculated to wound. Madison had perfected the art of public humiliation, disguised as friendly conversation. I excused myself and retreated to the ladies' room, splashing cold water on my burning face while fighting back tears of frustration and shame. When I returned to the ballroom, the live auction had begun. Items ranged from luxury vacation packages to exclusive dining experiences, with the bids reaching tens of thousands of dollars. Madison had somehow convinced the auctioneer to let her make a special presentation, claiming she had a surprise addition to the evening's offerings. She took the microphone with theatrical flair, her voice carrying across the hushed ballroom as spotlights illuminated her golden dress. The crowd expected another expensive item or exclusive experience. Instead, she pointed directly at me with her perfectly manicured finger. "Ladies and gentlemen, for our special bonus auction tonight, I'm offering up my dedicated little analyst for an evening of spreadsheet romance." Her voice dripped with mock enthusiasm as my heart stopped beating. "Who wants my boring number cruncher?" The ballroom fell into stunned silence as 280 pairs of eyes focused on me. Some faces showed shock, others uncomfortable amusement. A few displayed outright disgust at Madison's cruelty. I stood paralyzed, unable to move or speak, as humiliation crashed over me like a tsunami. Then the voice from the back corner cut through the silence like a sword. $1 million. Every head swiveled toward the source as a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit began walking toward the stage. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his bearing confident and authoritative. Something about his measured steps and intense gaze made the entire room hold its breath. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge that glinted under the crystal lights. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. "Agent Carter Wells, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced clearly, his eyes never leaving Madison's increasingly pale face. "She's worth more than your entire family's freedom." The microphone slipped from Madison's trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. Her golden dress suddenly seemed less radiant as the color drained from her cheeks. The crowd began murmuring frantically as the implications of an FBI agent's presence at their exclusive charity event sank in. Richard Blackwell pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with panic as he tried to reach his daughter. But Agent Wells had already begun climbing the stairs to the stage, each step deliberate and menacing. Madison stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights, her previous confidence evaporating as reality crashed down around her. For the first time in 3 years, I saw fear in Madison Blackwell's perfectly made-up eyes. Agent Wells reached Madison's side with the fluid grace of a predator approaching wounded prey. The ballroom's atmosphere had shifted from elegant charity event to crime scene in the span of 30 seconds. Madison's hand shook as she stared at the federal badge, her usual composure completely shattered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Wells addressed the crowd while keeping his intense gaze fixed on Madison. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, but federal business sometimes requires immediate attention." He gently but firmly took Madison's elbow, guiding her away from the microphone and down the stage steps. Richard Blackwell intercepted them at the bottom, his face a mask of forced calm despite the panic flickering in his eyes. "Agent Wells, I'm Richard Blackwell, Madison's father and CEO of Meridian Technologies," he said with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to handling crises. "I'm sure this is all some terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office tomorrow morning." Agent Wells studied Richard with the calculating stare of someone who had interrogated countless white-collar criminals. "Mr. Blackwell, I think it's best if we keep tonight's events exactly as they happened. Your daughter has provided quite an interesting display of character." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama, but uncertain whether they should flee or stay to witness the unfolding spectacle. Society matrons whispered behind jeweled hands, while tech executives checked their phones nervously, probably wondering if their own companies might be under federal investigation. Wells turned to me with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "Miss Morrison, I believe, could I have a word with you privately?" My legs felt like jelly as I followed him to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the straining ears of curious donors. Madison watched us with barely concealed terror, while her father attempted damage control, laughing too loudly and making excuses about his daughter's playful sense of humor. "I know this must be confusing and frightening," Agent Wells said quietly, his voice surprisingly gentle after his earlier display of authority. "But I need you to know that what happened tonight was not coincidental. The FBI has been investigating Meridian Technologies for several months." My mind reeled as the implications hit me. Investigating for what? Financial irregularities, money laundering, fraud, the usual crimes that happen when people think their wealth and connections make them untouchable. His dark eyes studied my face carefully. "We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activities at your company. Someone on the inside has been feeding us information." I glanced toward Madison, who was still surrounded by her father's desperate attempts at crowd control. "Are you saying she's under investigation?" "I'm saying that your company's financial records tell a very interesting story. And as a financial analyst, you've processed many of the transactions we're examining." Wells handed me a business card with his contact information. "I'd like to speak with you tomorrow about what you might have observed during your time at Meridian." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. 3 years of Madison's torment, 3 years of feeling powerless and insignificant, and suddenly I was potentially key to a federal investigation. The irony was almost too much to process. "Agent Wells," I said carefully, "if I cooperate with your investigation, what happens to my job, my career? Madison and her father aren't exactly known for their forgiving nature." He nodded with understanding. "That's exactly why we need people with integrity in situations like this. The Bureau protects its witnesses, Miss Morrison. And from what I've observed tonight, you've already been targeted for harassment. Helping us might be your best protection." The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that matched my turbulent emotions. I had barely slept, my mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The local news had picked up the story of an FBI agent's dramatic appearance at a high society charity event, though details remained vague. At the office, whispers followed me through the corridors like shadows. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others stared with obvious curiosity. The events of the previous evening had transformed me from invisible analyst to the center of corporate speculation. Madison's office door remained closed all morning, but I could hear heated phone conversations through the walls. Her voice carried notes of desperation and rage that I had never heard before. When she finally emerged around noon, her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her designer suit couldn't disguise her obvious distress. She marched directly to my cubicle, ignoring the curious stares of nearby coworkers. When she spoke, her voice was low and venomous, each word carefully calculated for maximum intimidation. "You think you're clever, don't you, Hannah?" she hissed, leaning over my desk until I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with coffee and fear. "Setting up that little performance last night with your FBI boyfriend." I looked up from my computer screen, surprised by my own calm voice. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Madison." Agent Wells was as much a surprise to me as he was to you. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against my desk surface. "Don't play innocent with me. I know you've been plotting against me probably for months, but you have no idea what kind of connections my family has. We can destroy your pathetic little career with a single phone call." For the first time in 3 years, I didn't flinch at her threats. Something had shifted inside me during those terrifying moments on the auction stage. Maybe it was the federal agent's validation that I was worth protecting. Maybe it was finally seeing fear in Madison's eyes instead of my own. "Madison," I said quietly, "if you have nothing to hide, then a federal investigation shouldn't worry you." Her face flushed pink beneath her foundation. You sanctimonious little nobody. You think you can threaten me, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. She spun on her designer heels and stalked away, leaving me with the attention of half the floor. But instead of shame, I felt something new flowing through my veins. For the first time since starting at Meridian, I had stood up to Madison Blackwell and lived to tell about it. Around 3 o'clock, my colleague Jessica Martinez approached my cubicle with the cautious expression of someone entering a minefield. Jessica worked in accounts receivable and had always maintained careful neutrality in the ongoing war between Madison and me. "Hannah," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "Can we talk somewhere private? I saw something last night after the fundraiser that I think you should know about." We found an empty conference room on the 14th floor, far from Madison's executive suite. Jessica closed the door carefully before turning to face me with obvious nervousness. "After everyone left the hotel last night, I came back to get my coat from the coat check," she began. "But I saw Madison's car still in the valet area, so I thought maybe she had forgotten something too. I went back inside and saw her in one of the smaller event rooms with a paper shredder." My pulse quickened. A paper shredder at the hotel. She had brought one from the office. I recognized it from the executive floor. She was feeding documents into it as fast as she could, box after box of papers. When she saw me watching, she looked like she had seen a ghost. Jessica paused, wrapping her arms around herself. "Hannah, she was destroying evidence. I'm sure of it." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Madison was already trying to cover her tracks, which meant Agent Wells was right about the investigation being serious. It also meant that any evidence of her crimes might disappear before the FBI could act. "Jessica, you need to call Agent Wells immediately," I said, pulling his business card from my purse. "This information could be crucial to their investigation." She stared at the card with obvious reluctance. "Hannah, I have a family to think about. A mortgage? If I get involved in this and Madison destroys my career..." I understood her fear because I had lived with it for 3 years. But something about the previous evening had changed my perspective on the cost of silence versus the price of courage. "Jessica, what if we don't get involved and she destroys other people's lives? What if there are more victims than just me?" Before she could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Conference room B in 10 minutes. Come alone. You're not the only one who wants Madison Blackwell to pay for her crimes." I showed the message to Jessica, who went pale as we realized someone else was watching our movements. Someone with access to internal conference room schedules and my personal phone number. Someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment to make contact. The anonymous ally, who had been feeding information to the FBI, was about to reveal themselves. Conference room B sat empty when I arrived, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. Rain streaked the glass as gray clouds gathered over Elliott Bay, matching the storm brewing inside Meridian Technologies. I checked my watch nervously, wondering if the mysterious text had been some kind of trap. The door opened quietly, and Margaret Torres entered with the measured steps of someone carrying dangerous secrets. As Chief Financial Officer, Margaret was Richard Blackwell's most trusted lieutenant, a woman whose integrity had been legendary during her 20 years at the company. Her silver hair was pulled back in his usual professional chignon, but stress lines creased her face in ways I had never noticed before. "Hannah," she said softly, closing the door behind her and engaging the lock. "I'm sorry for the dramatic secrecy, but what I'm about to tell you could get us both killed." The bluntness of her statement made my blood run cold. Margaret had always been direct, but this level of fear was completely unlike her professional demeanor. She pulled a manila folder from her briefcase and set it on the conference table between us. "I've been the anonymous source feeding information to the FBI. For 8 months, I've been copying documents, tracking money flows, and building a case against Madison and her father." My mind struggled to process this revelation. Margaret Torres, the company's moral compass, secretly working against the Blackwell family she had served for 2 decades. "Why?" I managed to ask. Margaret's composed expression cracked slightly. "My daughter, Emma, died of leukemia 10 years ago. She was 8 years old. Her voice remained steady, but tears gathered in her eyes. The Seattle Children's Hospital Fund that Madison has been embezzling from paid for Emma's final treatments. Every dollar that family has stolen represents hope stolen from dying children. The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. Madison's crimes weren't just corporate theft. They were attacks on the most vulnerable members of society. How long have you known about the embezzlement? I asked. I discovered the first irregularities last year during a routine audit. Payments to phantom consulting firms, mysterious cash transfers to offshore accounts, salary payments to employees who didn't exist. Margaret opened the folder revealing pages of financial documentation. I thought it was a mistake initially. Richard Blackwell built this company on integrity. I couldn't believe he would betray everything we had worked for. She pulled out a spreadsheet showing salary payments to dozens of non-existent employees, each receiving paychecks that were immediately transferred to accounts controlled by Madison and her inner circle. The amounts were staggering, totaling over $15 million across 3 years. When I confronted Richard about the discrepancies, he claimed ignorance and promised to investigate. But the next week, Madison called me into her office and made it very clear that questioning the Blackwell family's financial decisions would be hazardous to my career. I studied the documents, recognizing many of the transaction codes and account numbers from my own work. Margaret, I processed some of these payments. I had no idea they were fraudulent. That's exactly why Madison used your department, Seaton, she explained. You and your colleagues were processing legitimate transactions mixed with fake ones. The fraud was hidden in plain sight, camouflaged among normal business operations. The realization that I had been unknowingly facilitating Madison's crimes made me feel sick. But it also explained why Agent Wells needed my cooperation. My financial analysis skills could help untangle the complex web of legitimate and fraudulent transactions. Margaret continued pulling documents from the folder. The charity fund theft was just the beginning. Madison has been selling Meridian's proprietary technology to competitors, laundering money through fake consulting contracts and bribing government officials to secure defense contracts. She showed me copies of emails between Madison and executives at rival tech companies negotiating the sale of Meridian's cutting-edge encryption software. The buyers included firms in countries with questionable human rights records, meaning Madison was potentially helping authoritarian governments spy on their citizens. The total damages exceed $50 million, Margaret said quietly. But the real crime is the betrayal of everything this company once represented. As we reviewed the evidence, my phone rang. Agent Wells' name appeared on the screen, and I answered with shaking hands. Miss Morrison, I need to see you immediately. His voice was tense with urgency. We have a problem. Agent Carter Wells. The man you met last night is not who he claimed to be. Margaret and I exchanged alarmed glances as the implications sank in. The FBI agent who had dramatically revealed himself at the charity auction was a fake. Who is he then? I asked. We're still investigating, but we believe he's connected to the criminal organization we're actually investigating. Someone knew about our operation and sent him to disrupt it. Wells paused. Miss Morrison, you may be in serious danger. Don't trust anyone until we can sort this out. The call ended, leaving Margaret and me staring at each other in stunned silence. The federal agent who had seemed like my salvation was potentially working for the same criminals he had claimed to be investigating. Hannah, Margaret said urgently, if they sent a fake FBI agent to the charity event, they know about our investigation. We need to get this evidence to the real authorities before they can destroy it. But before we could plan our next move, the conference room door rattled as someone tried to enter. When the lock-held angry pounding began, accompanied by Madison's furious voice. I know you're in there. Hannah, and whoever you're conspiring with better come out right now. Margaret quickly gathered the documents back into her folder while I tried to think of an escape plan. The pounding on the door grew more violent as Madison's voice became increasingly hysterical. You think you can destroy my family with your pathetic little schemes? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Margaret pointed toward the door leading to an adjacent conference room. Emergency exit, she whispered. We can get to the stairwell without using the main corridor. As we prepared to flee, I heard additional voices in the hallway. Madison had brought reinforcements, possibly security guards, or other executives loyal to the Blackwell family. Our window of escape was rapidly closing, but Margaret had one more shock to deliver. As she shouldered her briefcase, she turned to me with grim determination. Hannah, there's something else you need to know. The fake FBI agent didn't just appear at the auction randomly. Madison hired him specifically to intimidate you and identify anyone investigating her crimes. The realization that Madison had orchestrated the entire dramatic scene made my blood run cold. The auction humiliation had been designed not just to destroy my dignity, but to flush out anyone working against her interests. We had walked directly into her trap. The adjacent conference room offered only temporary sanctuary. Through the glass walls, I could see Madison pacing outside conference room B like a caged predator, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with increasing violence. She had brought 3 men in dark suits who looked more like private security than corporate executives. Margaret pulled out her cell phone to call the real FBI, but before she could dial, one of Madison's security team appeared in our doorway. He was built like a linebacker with cold eyes and hands that suggested violence was part of his job description. Ladies, he said with mock politeness, Miss Blackwell would like to speak with you. Now. We had no choice but to follow him back to conference room B, where Madison waited with barely contained fury. Her usual polished appearance had deteriorated throughout the day, her blonde hair disheveled and her makeup showing stress cracks around her eyes. Well, she said, studying Margaret with newfound understanding. The loyal CFO and the insignificant analyst? What an unexpected partnership. Margaret stepped forward with the dignity of someone who had spent decades in corporate leadership. Madison, this company was built on integrity. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become. Madison's laugh was sharp and bitter. My father? You mean the man who taught me that rules are for people without enough money to buy their way around them? The man who's been stealing from government contracts for 15 years. Oh, the revelation that Richard Blackwell was also involved in criminal activity hit me like a physical blow. Margaret's face went pale as she realized the corruption ran deeper than even she had suspected. You see, Margaret, your precious moral crusade is about to destroy something much bigger than my little side projects. Madison continued moving closer with predatory grace. My father has been building relationships with defense contractors and foreign governments that generate billions in revenue. Your FBI friends are threatening to unravel decades of carefully constructed business relationships. One of the security men handed Madison a tablet showing what appeared to be surveillance footage. She turned the screen toward us with a cruel smile. This is from yesterday evening after the charity auction. Margaret, darling, did you really think we wouldn't notice you making copies in the executive file room? The surveillance video showed Margaret clearly accessing restricted files and using the copy machine. The timestamp proved she had been gathering evidence for months, just as she had confessed to me. And Hannah, Madison continued, your little meeting with Agent Wells this morning was quite enlightening, especially the part where you agreed to wear a wire to record our conversations. My blood turned to ice as I realized Madison knew about Wells' request for me to become an informant. Either she had the real FBI office under surveillance, or the fake Agent Wells had reported our conversations to her. Margaret and I were completely exposed, our investigation blown, and our safety in immediate danger. Now, Madison said, settling into a chair with renewed confidence, let's discuss how we're going to resolve this unfortunate situation. Margaret, you're going to contact your FBI friends and tell them you made a mistake. The documents you provided were misinterpretations of legitimate business transactions. I won't do it, Margaret said firmly. Those children's lives matter more than your family's criminal empire. Madison nodded toward one of her security men, who immediately stepped closer to Margaret with obvious menace. I think you will, actually. You see, we've done some research on your personal life. Your grandson Tyler attends Roosevelt High School, doesn't he? Drives a red Honda Civic, gets out of soccer practice every Tuesday at 4:30. Margaret's face went white as the threat to her family became explicit. Madison was willing to use violence against innocent people to protect her criminal operation. And Hannah, Madison continued, your parents, Tom and Linda, work at Morrison Manufacturing in Ohio. Such a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. It would be terrible if something happened to their jobs or their health insurance. The casual way Madison threatened my parents made my stomach clench with fear and rage. She had researched our families specifically to use them as leverage against our cooperation with law enforcement. But instead of backing down, something fierce awakened inside me. 3 years of Madison's bullying had prepared me for this moment of truth. I was tired of being afraid, tired of letting wealthy criminals believe they were untouchable. Madison, I said quietly, you just made a very serious mistake. She raised an eyebrow with amusement. Oh, and what mistake is that? You assumed we came here unprepared. I pulled my phone from my purse and held it up so she could see the screen. I've been recording this entire conversation. Every threat you just made against our families is documented evidence of criminal intimidation. Madison's confidence faltered as she realized her tactical error. In her arrogance, she had confessed to multiple crimes while threatening federal witnesses. You little bitch! She snarled, lunging toward me. But Margaret was faster, stepping between us with surprising agility. Madison, you're done. Hannah, send that recording to the FBI immediately. As I began uploading the audio file, Madison's security team moved to stop me. But Margaret had one final card to play. She pulled a small device from her briefcase and pressed a button. Building security has been listening to this entire conversation, she announced. I activated the emergency monitoring system when we entered this room. Everything you've said and done is now part of the official record. Madison's face went through a series of expressions, from rage to disbelief to dawning horror, as she realized how completely she had been outmaneuvered. The security men looked uncertain, unsure whether their employment contracts covered assaulting federal witnesses in front of building surveillance. But Madison wasn't finished. In her desperation, she made one final fatal mistake. You think you've won? She screamed, her composure completely shattered. My father has judges and senators in his pocket. We own half the politicians in this state. You pathetic little people have no idea how deep this goes. With those words, Madison had just confessed to a massive political corruption scheme involving bribery and influence peddling at the highest levels of government. Margaret and I looked at each other with the shared realization that we had stumbled onto something far bigger than corporate embezzlement. Madison's family wasn't just stealing from charities and selling corporate secrets. They were running a criminal organization that corrupted the democratic process itself. As if summoned by our thoughts, real FBI agents suddenly appeared in the doorway, led by a woman with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to arresting powerful criminals. Special Agent Sarah Chin, Federal Bureau of Investigation, she announced, showing her credentials. Madison Blackwell, Margaret Torres, Hannah Morrison, you're all coming with us for questioning. Madison's security team melted away like smoke as federal agents flooded into the conference room. The fake Agent Wells was nowhere to be seen, probably already fleeing the country with whatever payment Madison's family had provided. But as we were escorted from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had won this battle, while potentially starting a much larger war. Madison's parting words about owning politicians suggested that our investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government. The real fight was just beginning. The FBI field office in downtown Seattle felt like a fortress of justice after the corporate battleground of Meridian Technologies. Agent Sarah Chen led us through security checkpoints and into a conference room that seemed designed for interrogating high-level criminals. The walls were lined with photographs of agents who had died in the line of duty, a sobering reminder of how dangerous our situation had become. Margaret and I sat across from Agent Chen while a team of federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence we had provided. The recordings of Madison's threats and confessions were being analyzed by specialists who would ensure their admissibility in court. Ms. Torres, Ms. Morrison, Agent Chen began, you've provided us with extraordinary evidence of a criminal conspiracy that extends far beyond what we initially suspected. However, You're both now in significant personal danger. She opened a thick file folder containing surveillance photographs and financial records. The Blackwell family's criminal organization has connections to foreign governments, defense contractors, and corrupt politicians at multiple levels. They have the resources and motivation to eliminate witnesses who threaten their operation. The photographs showed Richard Blackwell meeting with men I didn't recognize in expensive restaurants and private clubs. Margaret identified several as defense contractors and foreign investors who had received preferential treatment on government contracts. We're placing you both in protective custody while we prepare arrest warrants, Agent Chen continued. But we need your continued cooperation to build cases that will hold up in federal court. Over the next 48 hours, Margaret and I worked with federal prosecutors to map out the full scope of the Blackwell family's crimes. The evidence was staggering in its breadth and audacity. Madison had been selling Meridian's encryption technology to foreign intelligence services, potentially compromising American national security. The Phantom employee scheme had generated over $15 million in stolen wages. The charity fund embezzlement had robbed children's hospitals of money intended for cancer treatment and medical research. But the political corruption was the most damaging revelation. Richard Blackwell had been bribing senators and congressmen to secure defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The same politicians were then pressured to support legislation favorable to Meridian's business interests. This is a RICO case, explained federal prosecutor Diana Walsh. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. We're not just prosecuting individual crimes, but an entire criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. As we prepared for the legal battle ahead, I received devastating news about Margaret. She had suffered a heart attack during our second day of interviews, the stress and exhaustion finally overwhelming her system. As paramedics rushed her to Harborview Medical Center, she managed to grab my hand with surprising strength. "Hannah," she whispered. "The safety deposit box. First National Bank Downtown Branch. Box number 473. Emma's birthday is the key code." I rode with her in the ambulance, holding her hand, as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The woman who had risked everything to expose corruption was now fighting for her life because of the courage she had shown. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to stabilize Margaret's condition. Agent Chen found me in the waiting room, her expression grim with new concerns. "Hannah, we intercepted communications, suggesting the Blackwell family is planning something desperate. Madison is no longer at her home or office. We believe they're preparing to flee the country." The next morning brought shocking news. Madison had attempted to board a private jet at Boeing Field with suitcases full of cash and fake identification documents. But federal agents were waiting for her, alerted by financial tracking that I had helped develop during our investigation sessions. The arrest was captured by news cameras, showing Madison in handcuffs as she screamed accusations and threats at the FBI agents. Her designer clothes and perfect makeup couldn't disguise the fear and desperation in her eyes as reality finally crashed down around her. Richard Blackwell was arrested simultaneously at his private club, surrounded by the same corrupt politicians and defense contractors he had been bribing for years. The coordinated arrest sent shockwaves through Seattle's business and political establishments. But our victory came with a price. Margaret remained in intensive care, her condition stable but critical. I spent every free moment at her bedside reading financial documents and preparing for the trials that would determine whether justice would be served. The safety deposit box Margaret had mentioned contained additional evidence that stunned even experienced federal prosecutors. 20 years of meticulously documented corruption, including recorded phone conversations, photographs of cash payments, and detailed financial records showing the flow of bribery money. Margaret had been preparing for this moment for 2 decades, quietly gathering evidence against the criminal organization that had corrupted the company she loved. During my third visit to her hospital room, Margaret finally opened her eyes with recognition. Her voice was weak but determined. "Hannah," she whispered. "Did they get them?" "Both Madison and her father are in federal custody," I assured her. "The evidence you collected is going to put them away for decades." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she smiled for the first time since her heart attack. Emma can rest in peace now. As Margaret recovered, I worked with federal agents to trace the final connections in the Blackwell family's criminal network. My financial analysis skills proved crucial in following money trails that led to corrupt officials and foreign agents. The investigation expanded to include dozens of co-conspirators from local judges who had accepted bribes to federal legislators who had sold their votes to the highest bidder. The scandal dominated national news as Americans realized how deeply foreign influence had penetrated their government. But Madison had one final card to play. From her federal detention cell, she began negotiating with prosecutors offering to expose even larger corruption in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her revelations would ultimately bring down a sitting senator and 3 congressmen. But they also confirmed what I had suspected since that night at the charity auction. The Blackwell family's crimes were just the tip of an iceberg of corruption that threatened the foundations of American democracy. The battle for justice was far from over. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle had been transformed into a fortress during the Blackwell family trials. Media trucks lined the streets as reporters from national news networks covered what legal experts were calling the most significant corruption case in decades. Metal detectors and armed marshals controlled access to the building where the fate of an entire criminal empire would be decided. I sat in the witness gallery preparing to testify against the people who had made my life miserable for 3 years. But my personal vindication seemed insignificant compared to the broader implications of the case. Democracy itself was on trial, represented by the evidence Margaret and I had risked our lives to preserve. Madison entered the courtroom in an orange federal detention uniform, her former beauty dimmed by months of imprisonment and stress. The designer clothes and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of criminal consequences. Her father followed moments later, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a frightened old man facing life in prison. Federal prosecutor Diana Walsh opened with a presentation that stunned even cynical court observers. The evidence showed that the Blackwell family had operated a criminal enterprise for over 15 years, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars while corrupting dozens of public officials. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh began, this case represents one of the most brazen attacks on American institutions ever prosecuted in federal court. The defendants didn't just steal money. They stole democracy itself, turning elected officials into paid employees of their criminal organization. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the evidence Margaret had meticulously collected over 2 decades. Financial records showed direct payments from Blackwell accounts to the personal bank accounts of senators and congressmen. Recorded phone conversations captured explicit negotiations for votes on defense appropriation bills. But the most damaging testimony came from Madison herself. Facing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, she had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the full scope of her family's criminal operations, including details that shocked even experienced federal agents. My father taught me that laws were just suggestions for people without enough money to ignore them, Madison testified, her voice hollow with defeat. By the time I was 21, I was already helping him launder money through offshore accounts and fake consulting contracts. She described a criminal empire that generated over $2 billion in illegal profits, with tentacles reaching into defense contracting, foreign intelligence services, and the highest levels of American government. We owned judges who would dismiss cases against us. We owned senators who would block legislation that threatened our business interests. We owned generals who would award us contracts regardless of whether we could fulfill them. Richard Blackwell's defense team tried to portray him as a legitimate businessman who had been led astray by his daughter's criminal ambitions. But the evidence showed he had been the architect of the entire operation, with the Madison serving as his eager apprentice in corruption. The trial revealed details that made headlines around the world. Foreign intelligence services had been paying the Blackwells for access to classified American technology. Terrorist organizations had unknowingly used encryption software that contained hidden backdoors allowing American surveillance. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the scope of political corruption. A sitting United States senator had received over $10 million in bribes over a 5-year period. 3 congressmen had voted against cybersecurity legislation specifically to benefit Blackwell business interests. As the evidence mounted, I watched Madison's composure completely crumble. The woman who had tormented me with such casual cruelty was revealed as a small cog in a massive criminal machine. Her public humiliation of me at the charity auction seemed pathetic compared to the national humiliation her family had inflicted on American democracy. When I finally took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. My testimony would tie together the financial evidence with the personal experiences of living inside the criminal organization. For 3 years, Madison Blackwell made my life miserable. I began my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. But I now understand that her cruelty toward me was just practice for her cruelty toward the American people. I walked the jury through the financial transactions I had unknowingly processed, explaining how legitimate business operations had been used to camouflage massive fraud. My analysis showed how the Blackwells had stolen money intended for children's hospitals, military veterans, and disaster relief. Madison Blackwell auctioned me off as a joke. I continued looking directly at her as she sat with her head down. But her family had already auctioned off American democracy to the highest bidder. The defense tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee, seeking revenge against my former employers. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming, and Margaret's 2 decades of meticulous record-keeping had created an unbreakable chain of proof. Margaret herself testified from a wheelchair, her voice still weak from her heart attack, but her determination unshaken. She described watching the company she loved being corrupted from within, and her decision to risk everything to protect the memory of her deceased daughter. Emma died believing that good people would always fight against evil. Margaret told the jury, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't let the money stolen from sick children go unavenged. As the trial progressed, additional co-conspirators were arrested and charged. The corruption network extended to state governments, foreign embassies, and multinational corporations. What had started as an investigation into corporate embezzlement had become a global scandal, but Madison had saved her most devastating testimony for last. On the final day of her cooperation agreement, she revealed that her family had been planning to fake her death and assume new identities in the countries without extradition treaties. We had complete new lives prepared in the Cayman Islands, she confessed, new names, new documentation, and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of our lives. The escape plan had been funded by a final theft of $50 million from Meridian's pension fund money belonging to thousands of employees who had worked their entire careers expecting financial security in retirement. Only Hannah's investigation and Margaret's courage had prevented this final act of betrayal. As closing arguments concluded, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was devastating, and justice seemed inevitable. But I had learned not to underestimate the power of wealth and corruption to escape consequences. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Madison and Richard Blackwell were found guilty on all charges, including racketeering, money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy against the United States. As the judge read the guilty verdicts, Madison finally broke completely. She collapsed in sobs, her cries echoing through the silent courtroom. The woman who had once commanded fear and respect was reduced to a broken criminal facing decades in federal prison. But even in victory, I knew the battle wasn't over. The Blackwell family's crimes had revealed systemic corruption that would take years to fully address. Democracy had been wounded, and healing would require continued vigilance from citizens willing to fight for justice. The price of freedom, as always, was eternal vigilance. 6 months after the verdicts, I stood in the gleaming lobby of the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force headquarters in Washington, D.C., wearing my new identification badge as Senior Criminal Financial Analyst. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman Madison Blackwell had once dismissed as a boring number cruncher now held one of the most important positions in federal white-collar crime investigation. The sentencing hearing had been a moment of profound satisfaction. Madison received 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, while her father was sentenced to 20 years for his role as the criminal enterprise's mastermind. The corrupt FBI agent Wells, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Stevens, received 10 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. But the real victory came when Judge Patricia Manning ordered complete asset forfeiture from the Blackwell family. Every dollar they had stolen, every mansion they had purchased, every luxury car in their collection would be sold to compensate their victims. Margaret Torres had recovered sufficiently from her heart attack to establish the Emma Torres Foundation, funded by recovered money from the Children's Hospital embezzlement. The foundation provided grants for pediatric cancer research and treatment, ensuring that Madison's stolen money would finally serve its intended purpose of helping sick children. I had been invited to serve on the foundation's board of directors, a responsibility I accepted with profound gratitude. Margaret's courage in exposing corruption had saved countless lives, and I was honored to help continue her work. My new position with the federal task force allowed me to use my financial analysis skills to investigate criminal organizations across the country. The Blackwell case had taught me that spreadsheets and data analysis could be powerful weapons against corruption and injustice. My first major case involved a network of defense contractors who were overcharging the Pentagon for military equipment while providing substandard products to American soldiers. The investigation techniques I had learned during the Blackwell prosecution helped identify the financial patterns that exposed the fraud. The personal transformation had been equally dramatic. The shy, intimidated analyst, who had once feared Madison's cruel remarks, had become a confident federal agent, capable of confronting the most powerful criminals in America. I testified before congressional committees, spoke at law enforcement conferences, and trained other analysts in financial crime detection. My parents, Tom and Linda Morrison, had initially worried about their daughter taking on wealthy and dangerous criminals, but they became my strongest supporters after seeing the positive impact of my work. The blue-collar values they had taught me about hard work and integrity had prepared me perfectly for the fight against white-collar crime. The relationship with investigative journalist Rachel Stone had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. We both fought corruption in our respective fields, supporting each other through the stressful demands of exposing powerful criminals. Rachel's coverage of the Blackwell case had won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. On a crisp autumn morning, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from an 8-year-old girl named Sarah, whose cancer treatment had been funded by the Emma Torres Foundation. Her crayon drawing showed a smiling stick figure labeled FBI Lady, arresting a frowning stick figure labeled Bad Person. "Thank you for catching the bad people who stole money from sick kids," Sarah had written in careful block letters. "You're my hero." The letter reminded me why the fight against corruption mattered. Every dollar stolen by criminals like the Blackwells represented real harm to real people. Sarah's life had been saved by money that Madison had tried to steal for her own selfish purposes. I visited Margaret regularly at her Seattle home, where she was writing a memoir about her experiences exposing corporate corruption. The book would be donated to business schools across the country, teaching future executives about the importance of ethical leadership. "You know, Hannah," Margaret said during one of our conversations, "I used to think that good people were powerless against wealthy criminals. The Blackwell case taught me that courage and integrity will always defeat corruption, no matter how rich or connected the criminals might be." The Seattle business community had undergone significant changes in the wake of the scandal. New ethics requirements for public companies, stronger whistleblower protections, and increased penalties for corporate corruption had made it much more difficult for future criminals to operate with impunity. Meridian Technologies had been restructured under new management, with the former employees, like Jessica Martinez, promoted to leadership positions. The company had implemented comprehensive ethics training and created an independent ombudsman office to investigate employee complaints. During a recent visit to Seattle, I toured the renovated Meridian offices and was struck by the positive changes in corporate culture. Employees seemed more confident and engaged, no longer afraid of retaliation for reporting misconduct. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when I received a handwritten letter from Madison Blackwell in a federal prison. The letter was a genuine apology for her years of harassment and a confession that she had always been jealous of my integrity and work ethic. I realize now that I was trying to destroy in you the very qualities I lacked in myself, she wrote. Your courage in exposing our crimes probably saved me from an even worse fate. I hope someday to earn forgiveness for the pain I caused. I had no intention of visiting Madison in prison or developing any kind of relationship with my former tormentor. But her letter confirmed that the experience had taught her important lessons about the consequences of corruption and cruelty. The broader impact of the Blackwell case continued to resonate throughout American society. 3 corrupt congressmen had been voted out of office. A senator had resigned in disgrace, and new campaign finance laws had been enacted to prevent foreign influence in American elections. Law enforcement agencies across the country had adopted the investigative techniques we had pioneered during the Blackwell prosecution. The combination of financial analysis, digital forensics, and traditional detective work had proven highly effective against sophisticated white-collar criminals. Standing in my office overlooking the Potomac River, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a cubicle at Meridian Technologies to a leadership position in federal law enforcement. The path had been difficult and dangerous, but every challenge had prepared me for greater responsibilities in the fight for justice. My phone rang with news of our latest victory. A multinational corporation that had been bribing foreign officials to secure contracts had just agreed to pay $2 billion in fines and cooperate with ongoing investigations. My financial analysis had been crucial in tracing the money flows that proved the bribery scheme. As I prepared for another day of hunting white-collar criminals, I thought about the lesson that had emerged from the Blackwell case. Ordinary people with extraordinary courage could defeat the most powerful criminal organizations. Integrity and determination would always triumph over wealth and corruption as long as good people were willing to fight for justice. The battle against corruption was never ending, but it was a battle worth fighting. Every criminal we prosecuted, every dollar we recovered, every victim we helped represented a victory for the rule of law and democratic institutions. Madison Blackwell had once dismissed me as a boring analyst, but she had been profoundly wrong. There was nothing boring about the fight for justice, and there was nothing insignificant about the people who dedicated their lives to protecting democracy from those who would corrupt it for personal gain. The spreadsheets and financial records that had once seemed mundane now represented the tools of justice weapons in the eternal battle between right and wrong. And I was honored to wield those weapons in service of the American people. What experiences have you had with workplace bullying or corruption? Have you ever witnessed someone in power abusing their position to harm others? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how ordinary people can stand up to powerful bullies. If this story inspired you to think about courage in the face of adversity, please like this video and share it with others who might need encouragement to do the right thing. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice triumphing over corruption and the power of integrity in dark times. Thank you for joining me on Hannah's journey from victim to victor, and remember that sometimes the most boring person in the room might just be the one who changes everything. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right.